The lights dim, the music swells, and the camera pans across a blurred image of a man once wrapped in layers of ceremonial security. Guards, motorcades, and flashing blue lights once formed the invisible shield around him. But today, Prince Harry stands at a crossroads where that shield no longer exists in the way it once did. His life, which was once defined by both privilege and suffocating surveillance, has now been thrust into a new battle, one not fought on the battlefield of Afghanistan, but in boardrooms, courtrooms, and press rooms. And at the heart of this newest storm is the Invictus Games, the very creation he poured his soul into, now becoming the stage for a clash of wills and authority. Imagine this scene. Harry, passionate and visibly agitated, sits across a polished table from the Invictus Games CEO. His voice is firm, almost trembling, as he makes what he believes to be a non-negotiable demand. Extra security. Not just for himself, but for Meghan, for Archie and Lilibet if they appear, for the reputation he feels is constantly hanging by a thread. But on the other side of the table, the CEO does something Harry had perhaps never truly anticipated. He says no. Not with hesitation, not with excuses. Flatly, directly, and with finality. A refusal that cuts deeper than Harry is willing to admit in that moment. And the echoes of that refusal ripple far beyond the four walls of that meeting. They touch the monarchy he abandoned, the global media that waits for every sign of weakness, and the athletes of Invictus themselves, who find themselves caught in the tension between Harry's personal fears and the collective spirit of resilience the games are meant to represent. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The introduction to this story cannot be told without returning, even briefly, to Harry's past. Because without context, his rage and despair risk being misread as entitlement alone. This is a man who, since the age of 12, has carried the trauma of losing his mother not just to an accident, but to a tragedy soaked in questions of safety, press intrusion, and insufficient protection. To Harry, security is not merely an administrative checkbox. It is the very line between life and death. Every demand, every plea, every heated exchange has roots that dig back to that Paris tunnel in 1997. And this makes the Invictus clash so much more than just a contractual disagreement. It is a wound reopening, a fear reigniting, and an identity once again put under scrutiny. But here is where it gets even more complicated. The Invictus Games are not simply Harry's personal stage. They are an international event, with multiple nations involved, sponsors underwriting millions, and veterans competing who know firsthand what it means to stand exposed in dangerous environments. For them, the games are about unity, courage, and overcoming obstacles without excuses. So when Harry, their founder and patron, storms in with demands for layers of protection that no other participant could even dream of, it sets off a storm of contradictions. Is this about the athletes? Or is this about a prince struggling with his place in a world that no longer bends to his demands? The CEO's refusal, then, was not just about costs or logistics. It was a statement. The games will not be reshaped to serve one man's insecurities, even if that man created them. And yet, pause for a moment and ask yourself, what would you do? If you had lived Harry's life, if you had walked behind your mother's coffin while the world stared, if you had seen threats both real and imagined painted across your every move, would you not insist on protection? Would you not feel betrayed when those closest to your mission told you no? This is where the story grips the heart, because it forces us to wrestle with a question that has no easy answer. Where does justified fear end and unreasonable privilege begin? As the introduction deepens, we cannot ignore the tension that Meghan Markle's presence adds to the picture. For Harry, she is his partner, his defender, the woman for whom he walked away from the institution. For critics, she is the driving force behind what they see as his paranoia and his alienation. When Harry demanded heightened security, was he doing so as a father and husband, haunted by ghosts? Or was he doing so as a man under influence, projecting Meghan's anxieties onto the games? This layer of speculation fuels the media, which thrives on framing every private dispute as a marriage power play. And while Meghan herself remained silent in that meeting, her shadow loomed over every word Harry spoke. What makes this story compelling? And what makes it worth the long dive we are about to take together is that it is not just about logistics, money, or even celebrity politics. It is about identity. Harry has long defined himself in contrasts: the soldier prince, the rebel royal, the advocate outsider. Invictus was supposed to be the purest expression of that identity, a legacy carved not by his bloodline, but by his choices. To now face rejection at the very event he birthed is a humiliation that cuts to the core. It tells him, and by extension the world, that his title no longer guarantees compliance, that his authority is limited, that the games belong as much to the athletes and organizers as they do to him. And that truth stings harder than any public headline. But the introduction cannot end without hinting at what lies ahead. Because this clash does not sit in isolation. It spirals. It leaks. It feeds the narrative wars between Harry and the royal family, between him and the press, between him and his own legacy. The flat refusal by the CEO plants a seed of mistrust that may grow into something larger, a fracture within the very institution Harry thought he had built as unbreakable. The stage is set for drama, not just between a prince and a CEO, but between competing visions of what Invictus stands for. Is it Harry's personal redemption arc, or is it the collective triumph of wounded warriors worldwide? And so, as the curtain lifts on this story, the audience is left suspended in a single question. When Harry's voice rose in fury and the CEO's words fell like a final hammer, what happened next? Did this prince walk away humbled? Or did he dig his heels in deeper, willing to risk the very survival of the games to secure his personal demands? The answers lie in the chapters to come. But for now, the image lingers. A man who once commanded armies, now struggling to command even his own creation. The fire is lit. The battle lines are drawn. And the story is only just beginning. The Invictus Games were not born out of comfort, nor were they conceived in the gilded halls of palaces. They were born in war zones, in dusty bases, in helicopters lifting off under fire, and in the silent spaces where soldiers tried to piece themselves back together after the chaos of combat. To understand why Harry clings so fiercely to Invictus, why he reacts with such fury when anything threatens it, one must go back to the days when he wore a uniform not as a symbol of royal ceremony, but as a man prepared to fight and possibly die alongside his comrades. Harry's time in the military was, in many ways, the most grounding period of his life. In Afghanistan, stripped of titles and ceremonies, he was simply Captain Wales. He was one among many, carrying the same fears, facing the same dangers, sweating in the same desert heat. For once, he felt he had escaped the royal bubble and become something real. But in those years, he also saw firsthand the cost of war. Not just the physical wounds, but the invisible ones. He witnessed men and women lose limbs, friends, and often, their sense of self. Those images haunted him long after he returned home, and they became the seeds of a dream, to create an international platform where wounded veterans could show the world their strength, not their weakness. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary. Sports as a tool for healing. Competition as a stage for dignity. The Invictus Games were framed not as a charity case, but as a celebration of resilience. Invictus, meaning unconquered, carried a message that transcended nations and politics. It was Harry's brainchild, the one thing he could point to and say, "This is mine," born not from privilege but from experience. And that is why, as the games grew in recognition, Harry guarded them fiercely. They were not just events. They were an extension of his identity, his answer to those who questioned his purpose beyond being the spare. But founding Invictus was not without obstacles. The early days were marked by skepticism. Critics doubted whether veterans from different nations, some of whom once stood on opposite sides of conflicts, would come together under one banner. Others saw it as another royal vanity project. But Harry pushed through. He met with sponsors, traveled across countries, and used every ounce of his influence to make sure Invictus was taken seriously. That relentless drive earned him respect, even among those who had once dismissed him. By 2014, the first games in London became a powerful spectacle that silenced the doubters. Veterans raced, lifted, threw, and fought with every ounce of their being, and the world took notice. That success, however, also tethered Harry's personal reputation to Invictus. Each time the games grew, his image as the compassionate soldier prince grew with it. It became his lifeline when royal scandals, tabloid wars, and family rifts painted him in darker shades. No matter what else was said about him, Invictus stood as a testament to something untainted. And yet, therein lies the problem. When your identity is so closely bound to a creation, every threat to it feels like a threat to yourself. When the Invictus CEO pushed back against Harry's security demands, Harry did not see it as a logistical refusal. He saw it as a personal betrayal, a crack in the foundation of the one thing he thought was truly his. The connection between Harry and the soldiers who compete is more than symbolic. In their scars, he sees his own. Not the scars of physical battle, but the scars of being hounded, of being pursued, of being a man who grew up in the glare of relentless cameras. Where others might see a privileged prince, Harry sees himself as another kind of wounded warrior, someone forced to fight invisible wars every day. Invictus, to him, was not just about them. It was about him too. And that unspoken truth is what makes the game so emotionally charged for him. But herein lies a tension that would later explode in that infamous security dispute. Invictus is not Harry's personal kingdom, even if he founded it. It belongs to the athletes, to the nations that support it, to the sponsors who fund it, and to the millions who watch. The CEO's job, unlike Harry's, is not to protect one man's image but to protect the integrity of the entire event. This clash of visions, one deeply personal, one organizationally practical, was inevitable. But in Chapter 1 of this saga, the focus must remain on why Harry's attachment to Invictus is so unshakable. Because without that context, his rage later on risks being misunderstood. The games themselves became more than a sporting event. They became a movement. Veterans who had been sidelined, dismissed, or forgotten suddenly had a stage where their courage was broadcast worldwide. Politicians praised them, audiences wept, and competitors found a sense of pride they thought was gone forever. Harry stood at the center of it all, often tearing up during ceremonies, hugging athletes, and speaking words that carried more weight than most royal speeches ever could. In those moments, Harry wasn't just a prince. He was one of them. And so, the Invictus Games must be understood not only as Harry's greatest creation, but also as his shield. Each medal won, each story told, each tear shed was a way to silence the critics who mocked him as aimless. It was proof that he mattered. Proof that, despite leaving royal duties, he had carved out something uniquely his. That is why, when security concerns arose, his reaction wasn't simply a matter of logistics. To him, the safety of the games wasn't just about protecting attendees. It was about protecting his legacy, protecting the only thing left that gave his life structure and meaning. This is where the emotional stakes of the story become clear. A man who once flew Apache helicopters into war zones now found himself in a different kind of war, fighting to control the narrative around the games. And for Harry, control and security are intertwined. To lose one is to lose the other. His anger at the CEO's refusal was not born from arrogance alone, but from fear. Fear that the games might slip from his grasp, fear that tragedy might repeat itself, fear that the last thing he truly owned could be taken away. There was a time when Prince Harry did not have to think twice about his safety. Every step he took, every venue he entered, every street he crossed was orchestrated by an army of protection officers. Security was not a request, it was a guarantee, a right that came with his birth. Growing up within the royal bubble, Harry was shielded from threats the public could barely comprehend. Terrorist plots, deranged stalkers, aggressive paparazzi. All of it was anticipated and neutralized before it ever reached him. Yet that protection, as heavy as it sometimes felt, was also a burden. It was the price of being born into a family where privacy did not exist and vulnerability was never allowed. But the defining rupture came when Harry and Meghan stepped down as senior working royals. The moment they severed official ties with the crown, the invisible wall around them disappeared. Security that once followed them unquestioned was pulled back. Funding dried up. Officers were reassigned. For Harry, this was not simply an administrative change. It was a gut punch, a reminder that his family's safety now rested not on duty but on decisions made by governments and institutions that no longer considered him a priority. To go from being one of the most protected men in the world to someone who had to negotiate for coverage was, in Harry's eyes, a profound humiliation. The pain of that loss was compounded by legal battles. Harry launched lawsuits against the UK Home Office, demanding the right to pay privately for police protection during visits to Britain. His argument was consistent. The threats had not disappeared just because he had. In fact, he claimed, they had worsened since his departure, with his every move scrutinized by critics, tabloids, and online trolls. But the government's counterpoint was firm. Royal security is not for sale, and precedence matters. Allowing a private arrangement for one royal could set off a chain reaction that undermined the entire system. The courtrooms became a stage for this dispute, each side refusing to yield. And in the middle stood Harry, convinced that his safety and that of his family were hanging in the balance. The shift from guaranteed protection to conditional coverage marked a psychological turning point for Harry. He had lived his life haunted by the memory of his mother, who died after a night where protection and planning failed her. For him, security was not about comfort, it was about survival. Losing that royal shield reawakened every anxiety, every nightmare, every what if that had followed him since 1997. To the public, Harry's demands for constant security seemed excessive. To him, they were the only way to keep history from repeating itself. Yet beyond the emotional scars lay practical challenges. Living in California meant Harry and Meghan had to hire private security, often at staggering costs. Estimates suggest millions spent annually on teams trained to handle high-risk profiles. Still, private security had its limits. They lacked the authority to access intelligence briefings, to coordinate with police forces in foreign countries, to lock down venues with the same reach as state-backed teams. For a man who had grown accustomed to being monitored and shielded by some of the best trained officers in the world, this downgrade was both unsettling and insulting. He no longer felt untouchable. He felt exposed. That exposure became even more glaring during public appearances. Every trip, every engagement became a logistical nightmare. Routes had to be checked, venues scanned, potential threats assessed. And unlike before, Harry had to personally sign off on these decisions, aware of the financial and political costs. The Invictus Games, with their international scale and high-profile guest lists, only amplified the stakes. Athletes, world leaders, celebrities, and press would all converge in one place. For Harry, the risks multiplied. In his mind, failing to secure the highest level of protection was not an option, it was negligence. But what he saw as reasonable, others saw as unreasonable demands that strained budgets and defied fairness. It is important to remember that Harry was not blind to the optics of his requests. He knew every headline would frame him as the entitled prince demanding special treatment. But in his mind, those criticisms were irrelevant compared to the safety of his wife and children. Meghan, too, had become a central figure in this narrative. Her very presence seemed to draw polarized reactions, adoration from some, hostility from others. For Harry, that hostility translated into heightened danger. Each insult, each smear, each conspiracy theory he read online reinforced his conviction that without extraordinary protection, the unthinkable could happen. And yet, his conviction clashed with a harsh reality. He was no longer a working royal. The institution that once justified every expense for his security no longer had the same obligations. In stepping away, Harry had traded royal privileges for independence. But independence carried risks. The world he and Meghan sought in California, freedom, privacy, autonomy, came at the cost of a royal shield that could not be replicated, no matter how much money was spent. This is the paradox Harry lives with every day. To be free is to be exposed. To be royal is to be protected, but also trapped. He chose freedom, and now he grapples with the exposure that followed. The Invictus Games became the perfect stage for this struggle to manifest. On one hand, the games symbolized everything noble about Harry: his military service, his empathy for wounded veterans, his commitment to a cause greater than himself. On the other hand, they symbolized his vulnerability, an international platform where the eyes of the world would be fixed on him, Meghan, and possibly their children. For Harry, this was a nightmare scenario without watertight security. For organizers, It was a logistical problem complicated by Harry's personal baggage. The games had always been about the athletes, not the founder. Now, for the first time, the focus risked shifting to him. This chapter reveals the crux of Harry's inner battle. To the outside world, the removal of royal protection was a bureaucratic decision tied to his own choice to step away. But to Harry, it was a stripping of his very identity, a reminder that no matter what he achieved, he could never fully escape his past nor guarantee his future. He was a soldier who had once flown into combat zones with military escorts and intelligence briefings. Now he was a father who could not guarantee the safety of his children walking into a sporting arena. That contrast fuels his anger, his desperation, and his determination to secure at any cost what he feels is rightfully his. As this story unfolds, one must keep in mind that every argument, every clash with the Invictus CEO, every demand for security is not merely about logistics. It is about a man wrestling with the void left when the royal shield vanished. It is about trauma unhealed, responsibility unshared, and the weight of being both a former royal and a current global figure. From royal shield to civilian exposure, Harry's journey is not one of simple entitlement. It is one of identity fractured, rebuilt, and constantly tested. And it is this journey that makes the confrontation at Invictus not just inevitable, but explosive. The meeting that sparked the storm was never meant to be public. It was supposed to be a behind-closed-doors negotiation, a matter of logistics between a founder and the organization that had grown beyond him. But it became the moment when Prince Harry, once shielded by unquestioned authority, was forced to face a word he rarely heard in his royal life: no. The Invictus Games CEO, a figure known for discipline and pragmatism, had heard Harry's demands, weighed them against the principles of the games, and refused without hesitation. That flat denial marked the beginning of a fracture that could not be concealed. Harry entered the room with expectations. He had prepared his case with urgency, laying out the threats, the risks, the possible consequences if things went wrong. He spoke not only as a public figure, but as a man haunted by the image of flashing cameras in Paris on the night his mother died. His words were charged with fear and conviction. He insisted that additional protective measures be put in place: more armed guards, controlled access zones, surveillance expansion, and an elevated presence of local law enforcement coordinated with private teams. In his mind, these were not extravagant luxuries, but essential steps to ensure the games unfolded without catastrophe. Yet the CEO listened with a face carved from stone. When Harry finished, expecting a sympathetic nod, he instead received an unambiguous rejection. The games would not be reshaped to meet one man's personal demands. The CEO's reasoning was simple but devastating in its implications. First, the games were not about one individual, no matter his title or role in creating them. Second, the requested security measures would set a precedent that could not be justified for other participants. Third, the cost of meeting Harry's demands would stretch resources meant to ensure fairness and equality for all. The refusal stunned Harry. To him, it was more than a denial of a request. It was a denial of his lived reality. He had come expecting recognition of his unique circumstances, the extraordinary risks attached to his name, the weight of being the son of Diana and the husband of Meghan. Instead, he was treated like any other participant in the games. And while equality is the very ethos of Invictus, Harry's pride and his fears could not reconcile with being leveled to the same plane as others in matters of safety. The atmosphere in the room thickened as Harry pushed back. His voice rose, sharp and insistent. He reminded the CEO that Invictus would not exist without him. He pointed out the media frenzy that followed him everywhere, the online threats that spilled into real life, the heightened attention Meghan's presence always drew. He spoke of Archie and Lilibet, of the nightmare of raising children under constant scrutiny. His plea was emotional, raw, and in his mind, justified. But the CEO did not yield. To him, the integrity of Invictus was at stake. To give in to Harry would risk turning the games from a platform for wounded warriors into a stage dominated by the anxieties of its founder. This was not a clash of logistics, but of visions. For Harry, the games were inseparable from his identity. For the CEO, the games were bigger than Harry. The refusal was not personal, but it felt deeply personal to a man who had always carried Invictus as his shield against irrelevance. That is why Harry's fury burned so brightly in that moment, because he felt stripped not only of security, but of significance. The refusal also carried symbolic weight. It was a reminder that Harry no longer commanded unquestioned authority. In the royal world, security demands were met as a matter of course. In the military, his safety was prioritized as a necessity of rank. But here, in an organization that valued equality and resilience above hierarchy, he was just another figure whose fears had to be balanced against the collective mission. That stripping away of privilege cut deeper than the refusal itself. The CEO's refusal also reflected practical concerns. Security was not a bottomless pit of resources. Every guard assigned to Harry would be one less available for athletes, staff, or attendees. Every closed perimeter created to protect him would distance the games from the very openness that made them powerful. The CEO knew that yielding to Harry would mean opening the games to criticism, that Invictus had become about safeguarding one man instead of celebrating thousands. For him, the refusal was an act of protection, not for Harry, but for the games themselves. But Harry did not see it that way. To him, the refusal was betrayal. Betrayal by a man he had trusted to carry forward the vision of Invictus. Betrayal by an institution that, in his mind, owed its existence to him. He left that room enraged, his thoughts spiraling, his trust in the very structure he had created shaken. It was no longer just about safety. It was about control, about influence, about his place within the only thing he could truly claim as his legacy. As word of the confrontation leaked, the clash took on a life of its own. Whispers turned into headlines, speculation into narratives. Some painted Harry as paranoid, demanding royal treatment he no longer deserved. Others saw the CEO as cold and unfeeling, unwilling to acknowledge the real threats that surrounded Harry and Meghan. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Both men acted out of conviction, but their convictions collided in a way that threatened to overshadow the games themselves. The boldness of the CEO's refusal set a tone for everything that followed. It drew a line in the sand. The games would not bend to personal fears, no matter how justified they seemed. For Harry, it was a devastating blow that would echo in every decision he made thereafter. For the CEO, it was a gamble, a stand taken to preserve the spirit of Invictus, even if it meant alienating its most high-profile figure. When Prince Harry's demands for heightened security were denied, the debate quickly shifted from personal grievances to broader questions of money and politics. Security, after all, is never just about the physical presence of guards and checkpoints. It is about budgets, contracts, political approvals, and the delicate dance between private and public responsibility. And in the case of the Invictus Games, it became a tug-of-war between Harry's fears, the CEO's pragmatism, and the financial realities that underpinned the entire operation. The Invictus Games had always required careful funding. While its mission was noble and its appeal strong, the games were not cheap to run. Sponsors poured millions into the project, governments contributed in various ways, and logistical costs ballooned with each international event. Venues had to be secured, athletes transported and housed, ceremonies staged, and media coverage facilitated. Every penny was scrutinized because transparency mattered. The games were built on trust. Trust that funds were being used for the athletes, for their recovery, for their recognition. So when Harry pressed for additional layers of personal security, the natural question arose: who was going to pay for it? Harry believed that his unique profile warranted special measures, but the CEO and organizers argued that shifting large sums of money toward his personal protection would not only drain resources, but also invite criticism. Would sponsors who donated millions to support wounded veterans accept that their money was being funneled into guarding a prince and his family? Would governments, already balancing budgets, justify the expense to their taxpayers? The optics alone were perilous. To some, Harry's insistence seemed less about protecting the games and more about protecting his image. Politics added yet another layer of complexity. Security arrangements for events like Invictus often required cooperation between multiple nations. Local police, intelligence agencies, and international security bodies all had roles to play. But once Harry stepped away from his role as a working royal, his standing changed in the eyes of many governments. He was no longer a representative of the crown. He was no longer entitled to diplomatic or state-backed protections. That meant every request had to be negotiated, approved, and justified in ways that were both time-consuming and politically sensitive. To grant Harry special treatment risked creating diplomatic headaches, particularly when other VIPs, heads of state, ministers, or decorated veterans, would be receiving more standardized security packages. This tension fed into the growing narrative of inequality. The Invictus Games, by design, were about leveling the playing field, about giving every participant equal recognition regardless of rank or nation. If the founder was seen to be cocooned in extraordinary security while others moved with minimal coverage, what message would that send? For the CEO, this was not just about money. It was about protecting the ethos of the games. For Harry, however, it was about survival and legacy. He could not understand why the risks attached to his family's presence were not being treated with the gravity they deserved. The financial stakes were not limited to the games themselves. Harry's broader security saga had already strained his personal finances. Reports of millions spent annually on private teams in California weighed heavily on him, and the legal costs of challenging the UK government for protection added another layer. Each new demand at Invictus meant opening the door to even more expenses that the organization could not simply absorb without consequence. And while Harry had the means to contribute, allowing him to pay for disproportionate security out of his own pocket risked creating the perception that the games had been hijacked by his personal agenda. The CEO knew this and refused to let Invictus become defined by one man's fears, no matter how valid. Behind the scenes, sponsors began to murmur. Large corporations that supported the games did so because of the inspiring message of resilience and recovery. They did not want to be associated with headlines about royal entitlement or financial mismanagement. Some even worried that Harry's demands could deter future sponsorships, making the games financially unstable in the long run. The CEO's refusal, then, was not only about protecting principles, but also about protecting funding streams that kept Invictus alive. He was gambling that standing firm would reassure stakeholders that the games remained grounded in fairness. But politics is never straightforward, and Harry's situation was more complicated than most. He was not just a public figure. He was a prince who had openly challenged the monarchy, a veteran who had left the military, and a celebrity who lived under constant scrutiny. Every move he made was amplified, and every refusal he faced was interpreted through multiple lenses: royal, political, financial, and personal. That made the security debate combustible. It was not just about the number of guards at an entrance. It was about what it symbolized, the balance of power between Harry and the institutions around him. Harry's frustration boiled over because, in his mind, he was not asking for extravagance. He was asking for recognition of reality. He pointed to the threats he had faced in the past, the attacks on Meghan and the press, the vitriol aimed at his family online. He argued that ignoring these realities was irresponsible. But the CEO and organizers could not prioritize perception over principle. They had to consider the athletes, the sponsors, the governments, and the sustainability of the games themselves. To them, Harry's demands looked less like necessary precautions and more like an attempt to reclaim privileges he had walked away from when he left the royal fold. The clash revealed a deeper truth about security. It is never just about safety. It is about money, politics, image, and influence. It is about who pays, who approves, who benefits, and who controls the narrative. For Harry, the refusal felt like another chapter in a long story of abandonment. A system once designed to protect him now leaving him exposed. For the CEO, the refusal was a necessary act to safeguard the games from being undermined by one man's personal insecurities. There is an irony in watching a man who was once born into unimaginable privilege suddenly stripped of the very things he believed were permanent. For most of his life, Prince Harry did not have to question whether his safety, his comfort, or his place in the world was guaranteed. It simply was. The system around him ensured it. Yet after walking away from royal duties, after carving out a new identity in America, Harry has found himself confronting a reality that is brutally equalizing. Privilege, once assumed, is no longer assured. And nowhere is this more evident than in the way he has been treated in the ongoing debate about security at the Invictus Games. The public reaction to Harry's clash with the Invictus CEO revealed just how far his image has shifted. Once admired as the cheeky, rebellious prince with a soldier's heart, he is now viewed by many as a man struggling to adapt to a world that no longer bends to his title. Tabloids and commentators seized on the story of his security demands, painting him as entitled and tone-deaf. They argued that the games were meant to honor wounded veterans, not to become a platform for one man's anxieties. Headlines spoke of a prince out of touch with reality, unwilling to accept that he was no longer shielded by the privileges of monarchy. But the story is more complex than simple entitlement. To dismiss Harry's demands as spoiled is to ignore the psychological scars that shape them. Harry's entire life has been marked by trauma tied to vulnerability. His mother's death, the relentless paparazzi, the threats made against him and Meghan. These experiences are not theoretical. They are lived realities. In his mind, security is not an indulgence, but a necessity. The difficulty lies in reconciling his personal fears with a world that no longer affords him the automatic privileges he once took for granted. The image of Harry as a prince without privilege became even more stark as he was compared to other members of his family. While King Charles, Prince William, and working royals continue to benefit from taxpayer-funded protection, Harry must negotiate and litigate for his. To him, this disparity is not just unfair, it is dangerous. To the public, however, it is a consequence of his choices. He left. He chose independence. And with independence comes responsibility. This framing has left Harry caught in a paradox where his pleas for safety are viewed not as human, but as hypocritical. At Invictus, that paradox played out vividly. The games are about equality, about leveling differences between rank and background. Veterans who lost limbs or suffered psychological wounds compete not as victims, but as athletes. They do not demand pity, they demand respect. Against this backdrop, Harry's insistence on special measures for himself appeared jarring. It risked undermining the very ethos of Invictus. The CEO's refusal was therefore not just a practical decision, but a symbolic stand. No one, not even the founder, would be placed above the values of the games. And yet, to fully understand Harry's fury, one must consider what it means for a man raised in privilege to be denied privilege when he feels he needs it most. His entire identity has been built on contrasts: royal yet soldier, insider yet outsider, privileged yet relatable. Invictus was supposed to be the crown jewel of his post-royal identity, the one thing that proved he was more than a title. To then be told within Invictus that he had no special privilege was a humiliation that cut deep. It forced him to confront the possibility that his influence was waning, that the one platform he thought would always center him was shifting toward independence. Public opinion only sharpened the sting. Social media erupted with debates. Some sympathized with Harry, arguing that he had every right to fear for his family's safety given the threats they faced. Others mocked him, calling him paranoid, suggesting he had created many of the dangers by provoking the media and turning his back on the monarchy. The narrative quickly split into camps: Harry as victim or Harry as entitled prince. But in both versions, the common thread was that he was no longer untouchable. The days of unquestioned privilege were over, and the world was watching to see how he would adjust. Meghan's presence in the narrative made the story even more combustible. Critics argued that her influence had fueled Harry's sense of vulnerability, that she amplified his fears and insisted on standards of safety that clashed with the ethos of Invictus. Supporters countered that Meghan was simply a wife and mother, advocating for her family's protection in a hostile environment. Whichever perspective one adopted, the effect was the same. The couple's every move was politicized, every demand scrutinized as either reasonable or ridiculous. For Harry, the personal became public, and the private became political, whether he liked it or not. The symbolism of being a prince without privilege resonates beyond security. It speaks to the broader arc of Harry's life since leaving royal duties. He has sought to redefine himself, to carve out independence, to prove that he can stand on his own. Yet at every turn, he is reminded of how deeply his identity is tethered to the institution he left behind. He cannot escape the comparisons. He cannot outrun the headlines. And in moments like the Invictus clash, he cannot ignore the fact that his demands, once routine, are now viewed with suspicion. This chapter is not just about a denial of privilege. It is about what happens when privilege is removed and a man must confront life on equal footing with others. For Harry, that confrontation is brutal because it strikes at the core of who he is. He wants to be both independent and protected, both relatable and exceptional. But the world will not allow both. The Invictus Games CEO's refusal made that truth unavoidably clear. And so, Harry finds himself standing in a space unfamiliar to him. A space where his title carries weight but not authority. A space where his fears may be justified but his solutions are not accepted. A space where the games he built now belong to something larger than himself. In this space, he is not the prince who commands privilege, but the man who must fight for recognition without it. And in that space, his rage, his frustration, and his despair reveal a man still searching for his place in a world that no longer bends to his birthright. Every time Prince Harry finds himself at the center of controversy, Meghan Markle's name inevitably surfaces in the debate. To some, she is the woman who gave him courage to leave a system that suffocated him. To others, she is the catalyst of his estrangement, amplifying his mistrust of institutions and fueling conflicts that once seemed unthinkable. The security dispute with the Invictus Games CEO was no different. Behind closed doors, Meghan's presence loomed large, not necessarily because she spoke in that meeting, but because her influence on Harry's thinking was impossible to ignore. For Harry, Meghan represents both love and vulnerability. His protective instincts toward her are heightened by the relentless public hostility she has faced since joining the royal family. From the earliest days of their relationship, Meghan was subjected to headlines and online commentary that bordered on vicious. Her race, her career, her family, her past, all dissected and attacked. Harry saw in real time how this treatment corroded her sense of safety and dignity. For him, it was déjà vu, a grim echo of how his mother had been hounded by tabloids. That parallel weighs on him constantly, convincing him that without extraordinary measures, history might repeat itself. So when Harry sat across from the Invictus CEO and demanded elevated security, he was not only speaking for himself. He was speaking with Meghan in mind. The thought of her walking into a packed arena, exposed to thousands of eyes and cameras, terrified him. The possibility of a single deranged individual slipping through was unthinkable. To Harry, Meghan was not just a duchess. She was his wife, the mother of his children, and the living reminder of what unchecked hostility could do. Every demand he made was filtered through that lens of fear. But Meghan's influence went beyond fear. Those close to the couple often describe her as pragmatic, someone who strategizes and anticipates risks. She is not naive about the dangers of public life. If anything, she is hyper-aware. Some insiders suggest that Meghan had privately urged Harry to push harder to ensure that nothing was left to chance. She had seen the online threats, read the conspiracies, felt the hostility when she appeared at public events. Her whispered influence, therefore, was not manipulative in the sinister sense critics often portray, but protective, a wife urging her husband to guard their family with every tool available. Yet perception is everything, and in the eyes of many, Meghan's role in the dispute became another symbol of her supposed power over Harry. Commentators speculated that she had fueled his anger, that she had insisted on demands that clashed with the ethos of Invictus. The narrative of Harry under Meghan's spell resurfaced, as if he were incapable of independent thought. It was a simplistic interpretation, but it gained traction because it fit a familiar storyline. Whether true or not, it reinforced the idea that Meghan was at the center of every fracture between Harry and the institutions he once served. The CEO, for his part, was not blind to this dynamic. He understood that Meghan's presence at the games would heighten the stakes. Her appearance guaranteed greater media coverage, greater public interest, and by extension, greater risk. But he also knew that bending the game's principles to accommodate one family's fears would spark backlash. If Meghan was seen to be driving decisions that compromised the equality of the event, sponsors and athletes alike might question the integrity of Invictus. For the CEO, it was a line he could not cross. No individual, not even Harry's wife, could dictate the security framework of an international sporting event. This tension between Harry's personal fears and the CEO's professional responsibilities highlighted the delicate role Meghan played in the broader narrative. She was both central and peripheral. Central in Harry's emotional calculus, but peripheral in the actual negotiations. She did not need to speak for her presence to be felt. She was the unspoken justification behind Harry's insistence, the silent reason he could not back down, the figure he feared losing most if things went wrong. It is important to note that Meghan's influence is often misunderstood because it is filtered through polarized opinions. To critics, she is seen as manipulative, pulling strings behind the scenes. To supporters, she is seen as a woman unfairly vilified, standing by her husband in an environment hostile to her very existence. The truth, as always, lies in the middle. Meghan is neither the villain of Harry's story nor merely a passive participant. She is an active partner, shaping his worldview through her experiences and reinforcing his determination to protect their family at all costs. At Invictus, this influence manifested as a clash of values. The games were designed to strip away hierarchies, to celebrate resilience without titles or privilege. Yet Harry's demands, fueled by his fears for Meghan and the children, threatened to introduce hierarchy back into the equation. The CEO's refusal, therefore, was not only a denial of Harry's request, but also a subtle resistance to Meghan's indirect influence. It was a stand for the game's independence, a reminder that Invictus was bigger than the personal struggles of its founder and his wife. Still, for Harry, Meghan's safety was non-negotiable. He left the meeting convinced that the refusal was a failure not just of logistics, but of empathy. He believed the CEO had failed to grasp the depth of the hostility Meghan faced, the reality of the threats she endured, and the consequences of ignoring them. This conviction hardened his stance, making compromise nearly impossible. In his mind, to yield was to risk everything. Thus, Meghan's whispered influence cannot be separated from the fury Harry carried out of that meeting. It was her presence in his life that magnified his fears, her vulnerability that deepened his urgency, and her support that emboldened him to challenge institutions, even those he had created. The story of the Invictus security dispute is therefore not just about a prince and a CEO. It is also about a husband and a wife navigating a hostile world, their fears colliding with the principles of an organization meant to stand for equality. For Harry, the debate about security at Invictus was not an abstract matter of logistics. It was the reawakening of memories he has tried, and often failed, to bury. Every time he is told his demands are excessive, every time someone questions why he insists on heightened measures, his mind drifts back to the image that defined his childhood, the night his mother died in Paris. That single moment, when the world's most photographed woman was taken in a flash of metal, screams, and camera bulbs, has shaped everything Harry believes about safety. It is the shadow that follows him, the lens through which he views risk, and the ghost that whispers every time he steps into a crowd. The trauma of Diana's death was unique, but its consequences are lasting. Harry was only 12 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin, the cameras of the world trained on his face as he stumbled through grief. He remembers the noise, the silence, the weight of millions of eyes, and the overwhelming sense of being unprotected. In the years since, he has often spoken of how the institution failed her, how security was lacking, how press intrusion was unchecked, how the system designed to safeguard royals crumbled at the moment it mattered most. For Harry, that failure has never been forgotten. It is the root of his mistrust of institutions, the justification for his demands, and the reason why no is a word he cannot accept when it comes to protection. This is why the CEO's refusal at Invictus cut so deeply. To Harry, it was not just a denial of resources. It was a reminder of the same complacency that cost his mother her life. He sees threats others dismiss. He imagines dangers others deem improbable. And he interprets any refusal to act as negligence. To him, history has already proven that the unimaginable can and will happen if precautions are not taken. Every denial is a betrayal. Every compromise a risk he cannot afford to accept. It is not only Diana's death that feeds these fears. Harry's years in the military exposed him to threats most civilians will never face. He lived under constant danger, knowing that a single mistake could be fatal. He flew missions, walked in hostile terrain, and lived with the reality that the enemy often targeted him more than others because of who he was. That experience hardened his understanding of risk. It also convinced him that vigilance was the only way to survive. Security, to Harry, is not an accessory. It is a lifeline, one he clings to because he has lived without it and seen the consequences. But trauma distorts perception. What Harry views as rational precautions, others see as paranoia. When he raises alarms about threats, organizers counter with data, statistics, and logistical assurances. They tell him the risks are manageable, the measures sufficient. But Harry's mind does not operate on probabilities. It operates on memories. He does not see numbers. He sees flashing bulbs, sirens, the coffin, the headlines. He does not weigh percentages. He remembers how quickly a life can end when the system fails. This gulf between his lived experience and others' practical reasoning is what makes compromise so difficult. Even Megan's entry into his life fed this cycle. Her presence, while grounding him in love, also reawakened the protective instincts tied to his mother. Megan's struggles with the press, her isolation within the royal family, her vulnerability as an outsider, all of it deepened Harry's conviction that history was repeating itself. He saw her hounded, vilified, and exposed. He heard echoes of Diana in the criticism, in the headlines, in the lack of institutional protection. And so he doubled down, convinced that he alone could prevent tragedy from striking again. That conviction is what fueled his clash at Invictus. He was not just demanding security for himself. He was fighting ghosts. The athletes at Invictus, of course, have their own shadows. They too live with trauma, with memories that haunt them. But for them, the games are a place of healing, a chance to prove they are more than their wounds. For Harry, the games are also a place of healing, but in a different sense. They are his way of making sense of his past, of channeling pain into purpose. And yet, when his demands for security collided with the game's ethos of equality, those same shadows threatened to overwhelm the very legacy he had built. The refusal forced Harry into a reckoning. Was he protecting the games, or was he protecting himself? Were his fears aligned with reality, or were they the echoes of trauma he could not silence? The truth is complicated. The threats to high-profile figures are real. The risks of public events cannot be dismissed. But trauma magnifies risk, turning possibilities into certainties in the mind of the survivor. For Harry, refusing heightened security was the same as inviting disaster. For the CEO, granting it would compromise the very values that made Invictus meaningful. Both positions had merit. Both were rooted in conviction. But between them lay the shadow of the past, growing darker with every clash. The public rarely sees this nuance. They see the headlines, the demands, the refusals. They frame Harry as entitled, Meghan as manipulative, the CEO as pragmatic. But beneath those narratives lies a man still grappling with grief that has never healed. A man who believes, perhaps rightly, that his family is at unique risk. A man who cannot separate his present from his past, his fears from his memories. And until that shadow lifts, if it ever does, his demands for security will always carry more weight in his mind than they do in the minds of others. The security clash between Prince Harry and the Invictus CEO did not exist in isolation. Even before whispers of the dispute leaked into the press, the royal family was already keeping a cautious eye on Harry's moves. Every statement he made, every lawsuit he filed, every demand for security reverberated back to Buckingham Palace. And as soon as the story of his explosive confrontation at Invictus reached the inner circles of the monarchy, the reactions within the royal household revealed not just frustration, but a widening gulf between Harry and the family he left behind. King Charles, burdened with his own responsibilities as sovereign, reportedly viewed Harry's demands with a mixture of sympathy and exasperation. On one hand, Charles has always understood the risks his children face. He knows the threats that swirl around the royal family are not theoretical, they are constant. But he also knows the realities of state resources. Security, especially the taxpayer-funded variety Harry once enjoyed, comes with layers of political oversight. By stepping down, Harry forfeited the automatic entitlement to that system. For Charles, this was a matter of principle. Choices carry consequences. To bend the rules for Harry, even in the name of compassion, would expose the monarchy to criticism it could not afford. Behind palace doors, Charles is said to have sighed heavily over Harry's latest clash, lamenting that his son still failed to grasp the limits of his new life. Prince William's reaction, however, was colder. William has long been painted as the steady heir, the dutiful figure who accepts the burdens of his role without public complaint. To him, Harry's repeated battles over security seemed self-indulgent, even reckless. Sources close to the heir have often suggested that William believes Harry dramatizes his circumstances to justify his distance from the family. The Invictus dispute, in William's view, was yet another example of Harry demanding special treatment while claiming to seek equality. He worried less about Harry's safety and more about the damage these headlines did to the monarchy's credibility. If Harry was seen as entitled and paranoid, the institution risked guilt by association. William's stance was clear. Harry had made his choice, and with that choice came the responsibility to live without the shield of royal privilege. Other members of the family reportedly expressed a mix of silence and private frustration. Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense demeanor, has little patience for what she sees as unnecessary drama. To her, duty has always outweighed personal grievance. She is said to view Harry's constant demands for security as a distraction from the larger issues facing the monarchy and the world. Queen Camilla, though careful never to comment directly, has her own reasons for maintaining distance. Her focus has always been on consolidating her position alongside Charles, not involving herself in the endless storms swirling around Harry and Meghan. These royal reactions highlight a striking dynamic. Harry believes his security concerns are matters of life and death, while the family views them as matters of politics, precedent, and optics. This disconnect deepens the divide. To Harry, their indifference feels like abandonment. To them, his insistence feels like ingratitude. The wounds of the past, the accusations, the interviews, the memoir, make compromise nearly impossible. Even when they acknowledge his fears, they interpret his public clashes as self-inflicted crises rather than unavoidable realities. The ripple effect of Harry's demands also extended into palace strategy. Advisors worried that his high-profile disputes, especially tied to Invictus, undermined the family's broader messaging of unity and stability. The monarchy thrives on the appearance of calm continuity. Every headline about Harry's fury, every story about his estrangement, chips away at that image. Some insiders speculated that palace officials quietly welcomed the Invictus CEO's firm stand, seeing it as a way to curtail Harry's influence without the crown having to intervene directly. It allowed the institution to keep its hands clean, while others bore the burden of saying no to him. Yet even within this atmosphere of frustration, there are whispers of concern. Some within the royal household reportedly fear that Harry's paranoia, fueled by trauma and constant refusal, could push him into further isolation. They worry that his inability to accept limits on security might strain Invictus itself, threatening a project that reflects positively on his legacy and, by extension, on the monarchy. For all the bitterness that lingers, Invictus remains one of the few initiatives where Harry's name is associated with service rather than scandal. If that collapses under the weight of disputes, it would be a loss not only for him, but for the wider royal image. The family's private discussions also raised a deeper, unspoken question. Should Harry ever be allowed to return to the fold of royal protection, even in limited form? Opinions differ. Some argue that reconciliation, however distant, would require acknowledging his unique risks. Others argue that doing so would set a dangerous precedent and reward behavior the family believes is destructive. This debate remains unresolved, but the Invictus incident reignited it. Once again, Harry's security became the prism through which his entire relationship with the monarchy was viewed. The Invictus Games had always been a beacon of hope. For years, they represented something untainted by royal politics or tabloid scandal, a platform where veterans and service members could rebuild their confidence, rediscover their strength, and showcase resilience on a global stage. But as Harry's security clash with the CEO spilled into public view, that beacon began to flicker. For the first time, whispers emerged that the games themselves were at risk, not because of financial collapse or lack of support, but because the personal struggles of their founder threatened to overshadow their purpose. Behind the scenes, organizers were unsettled. The games had never been about Harry alone. Yet his demands and the refusal they generated became the headline. Sponsors, who had invested millions to associate their brands with the noble values of Invictus, grew uneasy. Their priority was clear. They wanted to focus on the athletes, not on a prince locked in battles over personal privilege. Some began to quietly question whether their financial commitments would be jeopardized if the narrative around Invictus shifted from inspiration to controversy. A single headline about veterans triumphing on the field could now be buried beneath pages of analysis about Harry's demands. This was not what Harry envisioned when he founded the games. He wanted Invictus to stand apart, to be defined by the courage of others rather than his own shadow. Yet, paradoxically, his identity remained so intertwined with the games that every personal battle he fought bled into them. When he fought the British government for security, the games were mentioned. When he clashed with the press, Invictus was dragged into the conversation. And now, as he raged against the CEO's refusal, the games once again became collateral in his ongoing war with institutions. Athletes themselves began to feel the tremors. For many, Invictus was sacred ground. It was where they could compete without judgment, where their injuries did not define them, and where camaraderie trumped politics. To hear whispers that the founders' disputes might overshadow their stories was demoralizing. Some expressed frustration that their triumphs, hard-earned victories on the track, in the pool, or on the court, were being sidelined by a narrative focused on Harry's security. They respected him deeply for creating the games, but they also worried that his personal battles risked consuming what was meant to belong to all of them. The CEO's refusal, while principled, did not resolve the issue. Instead, it highlighted the fragile balance between Harry's personal needs and the collective mission. If Harry pushed too hard, the games could fracture under the weight of his demands. If the CEO remained immovable, Harry's relationship with the organization might sour, creating instability that threatened its future. Both men believed they were protecting Invictus, Harry from external threats, the CEO from internal compromise. But in their collision, the games themselves became the battleground. Sponsors and governments began holding quiet conversations. Could the games continue to thrive if Harry's controversies persisted? Would public support wane if headlines painted Invictus as just another chapter in the saga of Sussex drama? These questions, whispered in boardrooms and government offices, were dangerous. Invictus relied on international goodwill, on cooperation across nations and institutions. If that goodwill was eroded by the perception that the games were being hijacked by personal feuds, the entire enterprise could falter. Harry, for his part, refused to see his demands as a threat to the games. In his mind, they were a safeguard. If the games failed to provide proper security, and if something tragic happened, it would not only destroy his family, but the games themselves. His demands, he argued, were the only way to ensure Invictus survived unscathed. Yet in pressing so forcefully, he risked creating the very perception he wanted to avoid, that the games were about him, not the athletes. It was a cruel paradox. The more he tried to protect Invictus, the more he endangered its reputation. Public opinion added yet another layer of risk. Commentators questioned whether the games were being turned into a vanity project. Some tabloids framed them as a vehicle for Harry and Meghan to maintain relevance. Others pushed back, defending Invictus as a noble initiative unfairly tarnished by Harry's personal struggles. This polarization placed the games in a precarious position. They could no longer rely on universal admiration. They were now part of the broader culture war that surrounded Harry and Meghan, a war where every move was dissected and politicized. The athletes, though largely silent in public, embodied the true stakes. These men and women had endured physical and psychological scars, had fought back from despair, and had found in Invictus a community that celebrated their survival. For them, the risk was not abstract. It was personal. If the games faltered, so too would the platform that had given them a voice. They needed the focus to remain on their stories, their resilience, their triumphs. Not on the disputes of the man who created the stage. The games at risk, then, were not just sporting competitions. They were symbols of hope for thousands who looked to them as proof that recovery was possible. The CEO's refusal and Harry's fury had created a storm that threatened to overshadow that symbol. And as the controversy grew, one pressing question lingered. Could Invictus survive if its founder's personal battles continued to eclipse its mission? The moment the Invictus Games CEO said no to Harry, he knew the consequences would not be small. To deny a prince, to stand firm in the face of a founder's fury, was not a decision made lightly. It was a gamble, one that could either preserve the integrity of the games or ignite a storm powerful enough to undermine them. And as events unfolded, it became clear that this was more than just a managerial decision. It was a test of principle, of leadership, and of the willingness to put the mission of Invictus above the demands of its most famous face. From the CEO's perspective, the refusal was necessary. He had watched the games grow from their inception into a global event recognized for its authenticity and its power to heal. That growth depended on the trust of athletes, governments, and sponsors who believed in the mission. To grant Harry extraordinary privileges at the expense of equality would have compromised that trust. The games were not about one man's security. They were about thousands of wounded warriors, each of whom deserved the same recognition and dignity. The CEO understood that bending to Harry's demands might keep him satisfied in the short term, but it would set a precedent that could fracture the very foundation of Invictus. Yet the gamble lay in perception. Harry was not just another participant. He was the founder, the visionary, the figurehead whose name carried weight. To deny him so publicly risked alienating him, perhaps even pushing him away from the games entirely. Without Harry, could Invictus retain its symbolic power? Would the athletes feel the same inspiration if the man who had given them a platform distanced himself? The CEO was keenly aware of this dilemma, but he calculated that the long-term survival of the games depended on principles, not personalities. If Invictus became known as an extension of Harry's personal struggles, it would lose the credibility that made it thrive. The decision also carried personal risk for the CEO himself. To cross Harry was to invite scrutiny, criticism, and potentially global backlash. The media would inevitably frame the conflict as a battle between a prince and a bureaucrat. Narratives would swirl, painting him as inflexible or even callous. Yet the CEO believed that leadership sometimes required absorbing criticism for the greater good. He was willing to risk his own reputation to protect the ethos of Invictus. In his mind, it was a necessary sacrifice. What made the gamble even bolder was the context in which it occurred. Harry was already embattled, embroiled in lawsuits, estranged from his family, and scrutinized by the press. His temper was raw, his emotions heightened. To refuse him at such a volatile moment was to poke at wounds that had never healed. The CEO understood this, but he also understood that catering to Harry's demands out of sympathy or fear would only deepen the problem. If Harry was to remain the face of Invictus, he had to accept that the games were bigger than himself. That was the unspoken message behind the refusal. The games belonged to the athletes, not to the founder. The gamble extended beyond personal dynamics. It was also financial. Sponsors and governments were watching closely. They wanted assurance that Invictus remained a level playing field, untainted by favoritism. By refusing Harry, the CEO signaled to them that their investments were safe, that the games would not be hijacked by personal drama. It was a reassurance wrapped in defiance. But if Harry's fury escalated into a public fallout, those same sponsors could become skittish, fearing instability. The CEO's decision could either solidify their trust or shatter it, depending on how events unfolded. To make such a gamble required conviction, and the CEO's conviction was rooted in his own understanding of what Invictus meant. For him, the games were sacred. They were about men and women who had faced unimaginable loss, limbs, careers, comrades, and who refused to be defined by those losses. They were about courage, resilience, and unity. To warp that mission for one man's fears, even if that man was Harry, would be to betray the very people Invictus was built to honor. The CEO's refusal, therefore, was not an act of defiance against Harry as a person. It was an act of defense for the spirit of Invictus itself. Still, the gamble weighed heavily. The CEO knew that Harry's influence could not be dismissed. His voice carried across continents. His presence drew cameras. His story attracted audiences. Alienating him could damage the visibility of the games. But there was another calculation at play. If Invictus was to survive beyond Harry, it needed to stand on its own. The CEO believed the games had matured enough to be recognized for their mission, not just their founder. His refusal was, in a way, a declaration of independence. Invictus no longer belonged to Harry alone. Harry, of course, did not see it that way. To him, the refusal was betrayal. To the CEO, it was preservation. Both men were convinced they were protecting the games, yet they defined protection in completely different ways. Harry saw it as safeguarding lives, particularly his family's. The CEO saw it as safeguarding principles, particularly equality and fairness. Their clash was not just personal, it was philosophical. And that is what made the gamble so profound, because it was not about winning an argument, but about determining the very identity of Invictus. As the storm grew, the CEO remained unflinching. He absorbed the criticism, stood firm in interviews, and maintained that Invictus would not be reshaped for one man's demands. He took the risk that Harry's fury might dominate headlines, that sponsors might waver, that the public might misinterpret his refusal. But he held to the belief that, in time, the decision would be vindicated. That when the athletes took the field, when the world saw their courage, the noise of controversy would fade, and the spirit of Invictus would endure. When the story of Harry's security clash with the Invictus CEO leaked beyond the boardroom, it erupted into a media firestorm. What had begun as a tense private disagreement soon became international news, dissected across front pages, broadcast studios, and social media platforms. The image of a prince enraged over security demands being denied was irresistible to journalists. It had all the elements of a global spectacle: royalty, controversy, drama, and the backdrop of an event meant to symbolize healing and unity. The British tabloids led the charge, framing the story in predictable but cutting terms. Headlines accused Harry of demanding royal privileges he no longer deserved. Phrases like entitled, tone-deaf, and out of touch dominated coverage. Columnists drew sharp contrasts between wounded veterans who competed with quiet dignity and a prince they painted as obsessed with his own safety. To the tabloids, the clash was proof of what they had long argued. Harry was no longer the soldier's prince, but a man lost in his own paranoia. Across the Atlantic, American media told the story differently. Outlets more sympathetic to Harry emphasized his fears as understandable, given the history of threats against him and Meghan. They highlighted the trauma of Diana's death, Meghan's experience with public hostility, and the real risks faced by high-profile figures in today's volatile climate. Yet even in the U.S., coverage was not universally supportive. Some commentators questioned whether Harry was undermining the very ethos of Invictus by insisting on privileges denied to others. Social media, meanwhile, exploded into a battlefield of opinions. Hashtags about the clash trended globally. Supporters of Harry and Meghan defended his stance, arguing that no husband or father would sit idly by while his family was exposed to danger. Critics mocked him, suggesting he was using Invictus as a stage to relitigate his grievances with the monarchy. Memes circulated, juxtaposing images of soldiers competing at Invictus with headlines about Harry's security demands, the contrast biting and unflattering. Into this frenzy stepped a chorus of experts. Security analysts were invited onto talk shows to debate the legitimacy of Harry's concerns. Some agreed that his profile warranted extraordinary precautions, noting that threats against him were real and documented. Others argued that his requests were disproportionate, that they risked undermining the fairness of the games. Royal commentators chimed in, framing the clash as yet another example of Harry's estrangement from the monarchy. Mental health experts added yet another layer, discussing how trauma can magnify perceptions of danger. The story grew beyond the facts of the meeting and became a cultural conversation about privilege, trauma, duty, and identity. The frenzy was amplified by the timing. Invictus was approaching, and international attention was already turning toward the games. Sponsors had marketing campaigns lined up, governments were preparing delegations, and athletes were training for their moment in the spotlight. Instead of focusing on those athletes, the headlines focused on Harry. The fear among organizers was that the games themselves would be eclipsed, their mission drowned out by a narrative of royal conflict. The global frenzy also exposed the cultural divide in how Harry and Meghan are perceived. In the UK, the story reinforced negative narratives that had followed them since their departure. In the US, it sparked debate about celebrity, security, and trauma in a way that was less tied to monarchy and more tied to personal freedom. In Europe and beyond, coverage varied but often carried a sense of bafflement. How could a man who once commanded armies now be consumed by battles over security at a sporting event? The contrast was too stark, too dramatic, to ignore. What made the frenzy particularly damaging was its persistence. This was not a one-day story. It stretched across weeks, each new headline feeding the cycle. Reporters unearthed details of the meeting, unnamed insiders offered quotes, and every statement from Harry or Meghan was parsed for hidden meaning. The Invictus CEO, though maintaining his composure in public, became a reluctant figure in the spotlight, portrayed alternately as a principled leader or a stubborn antagonist. The games themselves became the silent victim, their message of resilience overshadowed by conflict. Harry, for his part, felt cornered. He saw the coverage as distorted, his intentions misrepresented, his fears trivialized. What to him was a matter of life and death was framed by the press as entitlement. Each headline cut deeper, reinforcing his conviction that he was misunderstood and unfairly targeted. Meghan, too, became part of the media storm, her name invoked in debates about influence, fear, and control. For the couple, the frenzy was a familiar nightmare. Once again, their personal lives had been hijacked by global media and spun into a spectacle. Yet in another sense, the frenzy was predictable. Harry has long been a figure who embodies contradiction, royal yet outsider, soldier yet celebrity, victim yet privileged. The clash with the CEO encapsulated those contradictions perfectly, offering the media a story that was both sensational and symbolic. It was not just about security. It was about a man caught between two worlds, struggling to reconcile his past with his present. The moment the news of Prince Harry's confrontation with the Invictus Games CEO broke, Buckingham Palace found itself thrust into a complex and highly sensitive situation. For decades, the monarchy has carefully cultivated its public image, presenting a picture of composure, duty, and unity. Any sign of discord within the royal family is amplified, dissected, and debated worldwide. Harry's clash was no ordinary dispute. It was an event that threatened to touch on the monarchy's most sensitive nerves: public perception, security protocols, and the delicate balance between personal freedom and royal responsibility. Queen Camilla, Prince Charles, and other senior family members immediately convened a series of emergency briefings. In private, advisors stressed that the situation had the potential to escalate into a full-blown media crisis. Royal insiders later revealed that the palace was torn between issuing a public statement and allowing the story to settle on its own. Too much commentary could be seen as interference, but silence risked appearing indifferent or disconnected from Harry's plight. The decision was complicated further by the international dimension. Media from the UK, US, Europe, and even Australia and Canada were all following the story in real time, each with its own spin. Within these meetings, the key question was simple but fraught. How should the palace respond without escalating the conflict or undermining Harry's credibility? Advisors highlighted the fine line between defending Harry as a family member and acknowledging that he had chosen a path increasingly independent from royal oversight. Publicly, Harry's security concerns were valid. Privately, his insistence on extraordinary measures for himself, and by extension, his family, risked portraying him as disconnected from the realities faced by other royals and the athletes themselves. Prince William reportedly weighed in, emphasizing that the Invictus Games were meant to be a celebration of resilience and courage, not a stage for personal grievances. Sources later described tense discussions where William expressed concern that Harry's actions could overshadow the very mission of the Games, framing them as a platform for celebrity rather than a symbol of recovery and solidarity. He reportedly argued that the palace needed to maintain the Games' integrity, ensuring that the focus remained on the athletes and their extraordinary stories. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla reportedly sought to mediate. Sources indicated she reached out to senior advisors and even made discreet overtures to Meghan's representatives. Her goal was to prevent a public confrontation from spiraling into a family scandal. At the same time, Camilla was acutely aware that Harry's behavior would be scrutinized for signs of broader issues within the family dynamic, particularly after years of intense media speculation about the Sussexes' relationship with the monarchy. Prince Charles, known for his meticulous attention to protocol and public perception, faced his own challenge. He had long recognized Harry's sensitivity to threats, his insistence on security, and his tendency to take matters into his own hands when he felt the stakes were high. Advisors report that Charles understood the fear motivating Harry, but also feared that capitulating to every demand could set a precedent, raising expectations for security and privileges beyond what was considered standard for a former senior royal. The tension was a delicate balancing act, acknowledging Harry's fears while maintaining a framework of accountability and fairness. The royal communications team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, drafting statements, coordinating with press offices, and preparing contingency messaging became a 24-hour operation. Their goal was to convey concern for Harry's safety without appearing to inflame the situation. Every word was scrutinized for potential double meanings, every sentence analyzed for unintended implications. Even a single misstep could trigger a media storm, inflating a private disagreement into a global spectacle. Beyond the official channels, informal networks within the royal family buzzed with concern. Courtiers, personal assistants, and security personnel shared reports of Harry's frustration, noting that he felt misunderstood and marginalized. Conversations with former military aides revealed that Harry's insistence on security measures was tied to deep-seated anxieties dating back to his service years, compounded by his family's history of intense media scrutiny. It was not merely about protection. It was about control, agency, and trust in a world that had repeatedly betrayed him. The royal family's response also involved a careful public relations strategy. Analysts were brought in to anticipate media reaction, chart social sentiment, and prepare for potential backlash. The palace recognized that the public narrative could quickly turn against Harry if the story was framed as self-indulgent or disconnected from the values of service and sacrifice. Messaging had to be precise, showing empathy while reinforcing that no individual, regardless of rank or fame, should compromise the integrity of an institution or the safety of its participants. Privately, there was worry about the ripple effects. Royal events planned for the months surrounding the Invictus Games were suddenly at risk of being overshadowed by controversy. Charitable engagements, public appearances, and even diplomatic meetings faced the possibility of media intrusion, turning planned celebrations of service and achievement into fodder for debates about entitlement, privilege, and personal responsibility. Insiders stressed that every member of the family was aware of the delicate optics. Harry's actions could reflect on the monarchy as a whole, regardless of intent. Yet despite these pressures, the palace also had to navigate a personal dimension. Relationships were strained, but love and loyalty remained. Advisors report that senior family members were determined not to let public opinion dictate personal bonds. They sought to maintain communication with Harry, offering counsel and guidance, while balancing the need for independence and accountability. This duality, protecting Harry while safeguarding institutional integrity, became the defining challenge of the palace's response. In the end, the royal response was a study in careful calculation. Publicly, statements were minimal, emphasizing respect for the Invictus Games and concern for all participants' safety. Behind the scenes, a network of advisors, courtiers, and family members worked to manage perceptions, mediate tensions, and prevent further escalation. The story had already ignited the public imagination, but the palace's approach reflected a long-standing strategy. Let facts speak, avoid unnecessary commentary, and maintain a steady hand amid turbulence. As Harry prepared to attend the games, he remained acutely aware of the family's attention. Every decision he made would be scrutinized not only for its immediate impact on security, but also for its symbolic resonance. Was he a concerned father and husband, or was he a figure struggling to reconcile past trauma with present responsibility? The answer would be debated in newspapers, on television, and across social media, but inside the palace, the focus remained on balancing care, protocol, and perception. Almost immediately after the news of Prince Harry's heated discussion with the Invictus Games CEO hit the press, a media firestorm erupted. In today's age of instantaneous reporting, nothing stays private for long, and the global obsession with the royal family guaranteed that every angle would be scrutinized. Headlines from London to Los Angeles flashed across screens, some sympathetic, others highly critical, and a few downright sensational. The narrative shifted rapidly, transforming what might have been a contained disagreement into a story of monumental public interest. Within hours, leading newspapers in the United Kingdom published accounts of the confrontation, citing anonymous sources within the game's organizing committee. Phrases like Harry's fury and clash over security dominated the headlines, emphasizing tension and emotional volatility. Across the Atlantic, U.S. media outlets framed the story with a mixture of intrigue and moral judgment, highlighting the contrast between Harry's royal lineage and his increasingly independent persona. Social media amplified these narratives exponentially. Tweets, threads, and viral posts dissected every possible interpretation, from supportive arguments about personal safety to accusations of entitlement and spectacle. Commentators debated not only the incident itself, but the implications it carried. Why would a royal, no longer fully bound by official security protocols, insist on extraordinary measures? Was Harry overstepping boundaries, or was he merely asserting legitimate concerns for the protection of himself and his family? News pundits dissected body language in photographs, tone in recorded statements, and even choice of words in interviews, reading intent and temperament into every gesture. The story became less about the event and more about what it represented. The ongoing evolution of the Sussexes' relationship with the monarchy, the public's fascination with royal drama, and the intersection of celebrity, responsibility, and scrutiny. Experts were brought into discussions across news panels to provide insight into the stakes involved. Security analysts highlighted that organizing high-profile international events comes with a delicate balance between providing safety and maintaining accessibility. Military consultants discussed Harry's training, the validity of his concerns, and the potential risks of non-standard security requests. Psychologists speculated on the emotional toll of being constantly observed and judged, emphasizing how past experiences, including personal trauma and intense media scrutiny, could influence behavior in high-pressure scenarios. Each perspective added a layer of complexity, fueling the narrative's dramatic tension and keeping the public engrossed. The media also examined the personal side of the story. Interviews with former aides and palace insiders painted Harry as a man caught between competing demands: his desire for autonomy, his responsibility to uphold certain public expectations, and his need to protect his loved ones. Analysts compared the situation to previous royal controversies, drawing parallels to past disputes over protocol, security, and personal agency. Some narratives framed the confrontation as a continuation of Harry's long-standing struggle with the weight of public life, portraying him as a figure both heroic and vulnerable. Others highlighted potential arrogance, emphasizing the perception of entitlement and detachment from broader responsibilities. Social media platforms amplified public emotion, often blurring the line between fact and speculation. Viral threads debated the fairness of the CEO's refusal, questioned the adequacy of standard security measures, and pondered the potential fallout for the games themselves. Influencers and commentators weighed in with strong opinions, their content generating thousands of comments and shares within minutes. Memes, GIFs, and short video clips proliferated, transforming a serious disagreement into both an object of humor and intense debate. Even casual observers who had no connection to the royal family were drawn in, captivated by the combination of celebrity, conflict, and potential scandal. Traditional print media and broadcast outlets responded in turn. Newspapers devoted extensive feature articles analyzing the context, history, and personalities involved, while television networks aired panel discussions with experts and commentators. International outlets, especially in countries with ties to the Commonwealth, explored not only the immediate dispute, but also its broader implications for global perceptions of the royal family. Coverage often included visual timelines, footage from previous Invictus Games, and interviews with participants, creating a narrative that was both comprehensive and highly compelling. The pressure on the palace and Harry's inner circle intensified as the media storm grew. Every action, from travel plans to public appearances, was now filtered through the lens of potential controversy. Advisors scrambled to manage both the factual narrative and the perception of intent. It was no longer sufficient to focus solely on logistics or security. The emotional, psychological, and reputational stakes had skyrocketed. Every decision required foresight, strategy, and a keen understanding of how the global audience might interpret even minor details. Amid this frenzy, the human aspect of the story remained undeniable. Journalists reported on the visible strain on Harry, noting signs of tension and frustration in public appearances and private interactions. Friends and confidants shared accounts of late-night discussions, heated phone calls, and moments of introspection. The public saw glimpses of a man grappling with both personal responsibility and the relentless gaze of the world. Emotional resonance fueled engagement, drawing audiences deeper into the unfolding drama. Behind the polished headlines and viral social media posts, a very different story was unfolding, one that the public would never fully see. Inside the boardrooms and private offices of the Invictus Games Organizing Committee, tensions simmered as leaders attempted to navigate the fallout from Prince Harry's recent demands. The CEO, a seasoned professional accustomed to high-pressure situations, now found himself at the center of a storm that was as much about perception as it was about policy. Every decision carried weight, and every conversation risked leaking to the press. Harry's security request had not been trivial. He had insisted on an unprecedented level of personal protection, citing specific threats and expressing concerns about past incidents where public figures faced unexpected dangers. While the request was grounded in reality, the CEO and his team were faced with logistical and legal constraints that made full compliance challenging. They knew that bending rules for one participant could set a precedent, creating expectations that could ripple through future events. Furthermore, accommodating such measures required a recalibration of staffing, technology, and emergency protocols, each element scrutinized not only internally, but by external authorities responsible for public safety. The moment the news of Prince Harry's confrontation with the Invictus Games CEO broke, Buckingham Palace found itself thrust into a complex and highly sensitive situation. For decades, the monarchy has carefully cultivated its public image, presenting a picture of composure, duty, and unity. Any sign of discord within the royal family is amplified, dissected, and debated worldwide. Harry's clash was no ordinary dispute. It was an event that threatened to touch on the monarchy's most sensitive nerves: public perception, security protocols, and the delicate balance between personal freedom and royal responsibility. Queen Camilla, Prince Charles, and other senior family members immediately convened a series of emergency briefings. In private, advisors stressed that the situation had the potential to escalate into a full-blown media crisis. Royal insiders later revealed that the palace was torn between issuing a public statement and allowing the story to settle on its own. Too much commentary could be seen as interference, but silence risked appearing indifferent or disconnected from Harry's plight. The decision was complicated further by the international dimension. Media from the UK, US, Europe, and even Australia and Canada were all following the story in real time, each with its own spin. Within these meetings, the key question was simple but fraught. How should the palace respond without escalating the conflict or undermining Harry's credibility? Advisors highlighted the fine line between defending Harry as a family member and acknowledging that he had chosen a path increasingly independent from royal oversight. Publicly, Harry's security concerns were valid. Privately, his insistence on extraordinary measures for himself, and by extension, his family, risked portraying him as disconnected from the realities faced by other royals and the athletes themselves. Prince William reportedly weighed in, emphasizing that the Invictus Games were meant to be a celebration of resilience and courage, not a stage for personal grievances. Sources later described tense discussions where William expressed concern that Harry's actions could overshadow the very mission of the Games, framing them as a platform for celebrity rather than a symbol of recovery and solidarity. He reportedly argued that the palace needed to maintain the Games' integrity, ensuring that the focus remained on the athletes and their extraordinary stories. Meanwhile, Queen Camilla reportedly sought to mediate. Sources indicated she reached out to senior advisors and even made discreet overtures to Meghan's representatives. Her goal was to prevent a public confrontation from spiraling into a family scandal. At the same time, Camilla was acutely aware that Harry's behavior would be scrutinized for signs of broader issues within the family dynamic, particularly after years of intense media speculation about the Sussexes' relationship with the monarchy. Prince Charles, known for his meticulous attention to protocol and public perception, faced his own challenge. He had long recognized Harry's sensitivity to threats, his insistence on security, and his tendency to take matters into his own hands when he felt the stakes were high. Advisors report that Charles understood the fear motivating Harry, but also feared that capitulating to every demand could set a precedent, raising expectations for security and privileges beyond what was considered standard for a former senior royal. The tension was a delicate balancing act, acknowledging Harry's fears while maintaining a framework of accountability and fairness. The royal communications team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, drafting statements, coordinating with press offices, and preparing contingency messaging became a 24-hour operation. Their goal was to convey concern for Harry's safety without appearing to inflame the situation. Every word was scrutinized for potential double meanings, every sentence analyzed for unintended implications. Even a single misstep could trigger a media storm, inflating a private disagreement into a global spectacle. Beyond the official channels, informal networks within the royal family buzzed with concern. Courtiers, personal assistants, and security personnel shared reports of Harry's frustration, noting that he felt misunderstood and marginalized. Conversations with former military aides revealed that Harry's insistence on security measures was tied to deep-seated anxieties dating back to his service years, compounded by his family's history of intense media scrutiny. It was not merely about protection. It was about control, agency, and trust in a world that had repeatedly betrayed him. The royal family's response also involved a careful public relations strategy. Analysts were brought in to anticipate media reaction, chart social sentiment, and prepare for potential backlash. The palace recognized that the public narrative could quickly turn against Harry if the story was framed as self-indulgent or disconnected from the values of service and sacrifice. Messaging had to be precise, showing empathy while reinforcing that no individual, regardless of rank or fame, should compromise the integrity of an institution or the safety of its participants. Privately, there was worry about the ripple effects. Royal events planned for the months surrounding the Invictus Games were suddenly at risk of being overshadowed by controversy. Charitable engagements, public appearances, and even diplomatic meetings faced the possibility of media intrusion, turning planned celebrations of service and achievement into fodder for debates about entitlement, privilege, and personal responsibility. Insiders stressed that every member of the family was aware of the delicate optics. Harry's actions could reflect on the monarchy as a whole, regardless of intent. Yet despite these pressures, the palace also had to navigate a personal dimension. Relationships were strained, but love and loyalty remained. Advisors report that senior family members were determined not to let public opinion dictate personal bonds. They sought to maintain communication with Harry, offering counsel and guidance, while balancing the need for independence and accountability. This duality, protecting Harry while safeguarding institutional integrity, became the defining challenge of the palace's response. In the end, the royal response was a study in careful calculation. Publicly, statements were minimal, emphasizing respect for the Invictus Games and concern for all participants' safety. Behind the scenes, a network of advisors, courtiers, and family members worked to manage perceptions, mediate tensions, and prevent further escalation. The story had already ignited the public imagination, but the palace's approach reflected a long-standing strategy. Let facts speak, avoid unnecessary commentary, and maintain a steady hand amid turbulence. As Harry prepared to attend the games, he remained acutely aware of the family's attention. Every decision he made would be scrutinized not only for its immediate impact on security, but also for its symbolic resonance. Was he a concerned father and husband, or was he a figure struggling to reconcile past trauma with present responsibility? The answer would be debated in newspapers, on television, and across social media, but inside the palace, the focus remained on balancing care, protocol, and perception. Almost immediately after the news of Prince Harry's heated discussion with the Invictus Games CEO hit the press, a media firestorm erupted. In today's age of instantaneous reporting, nothing stays private for long, and the global obsession with the royal family guaranteed that every angle would be scrutinized. Headlines from London to Los Angeles flashed across screens, some sympathetic, others highly critical, and a few downright sensational. The narrative shifted rapidly, transforming what might have been a contained disagreement into a story of monumental public interest. Within hours, leading newspapers in the United Kingdom published accounts of the confrontation, citing anonymous sources within the game's organizing committee. Phrases like Harry's fury and clash over security dominated the headlines, emphasizing tension and emotional volatility. Across the Atlantic, U.S. media outlets framed the story with a mixture of intrigue and moral judgment, highlighting the contrast between Harry's royal lineage and his increasingly independent persona. Social media amplified these narratives exponentially. Tweets, threads, and viral posts dissected every possible interpretation, from supportive arguments about personal safety to accusations of entitlement and spectacle. Commentators debated not only the incident itself, but the implications it carried. Why would a royal, no longer fully bound by official security protocols, insist on extraordinary measures? Was Harry overstepping boundaries, or was he merely asserting legitimate concerns for the protection of himself and his family? News pundits dissected body language in photographs, tone in recorded statements, and even choice of words in interviews, reading intent and temperament into every gesture. The story became less about the event and more about what it represented. The ongoing evolution of the Sussexes' relationship with the monarchy, the public's fascination with royal drama, and the intersection of celebrity, responsibility, and scrutiny. Experts were brought into discussions across news panels to provide insight into the stakes involved. Security analysts highlighted that organizing high-profile international events comes with a delicate balance between providing safety and maintaining accessibility. Military consultants discussed Harry's training, the validity of his concerns, and the potential risks of non-standard security requests. Psychologists speculated on the emotional toll of being constantly observed and judged, emphasizing how past experiences, including personal trauma and intense media scrutiny, could influence behavior in high-pressure scenarios. Each perspective added a layer of complexity, fueling the narrative's dramatic tension and keeping the public engrossed. The media also examined the personal side of the story. Interviews with former aides and palace insiders painted Harry as a man caught between competing demands, his desire for autonomy, his responsibility to uphold certain public expectations, and his need to protect his loved ones. Analysts compared the situation to previous royal controversies, drawing parallels to past disputes over protocol, security, and personal agency. Some narratives framed the confrontation as a continuation of Harry's long-standing struggle with the weight of public life, portraying him as a figure both heroic and vulnerable. Others highlighted potential arrogance, emphasizing the perception of entitlement and detachment from broader responsibilities. Social media platforms amplified public emotion, often blurring the line between fact and speculation. Viral threads debated the fairness of the CEO's refusal, questioned the adequacy of standard security measures, and pondered the potential fallout for the games themselves. Influencers and commentators weighed in with strong opinions, their content generating thousands of comments and shares within minutes. Memes, GIFs, and short video clips proliferated, transforming a serious disagreement into both an object of humor and intense debate. Even casual observers who had no connection to the royal family were drawn in, captivated by the combination of celebrity, conflict, and potential scandal. Traditional print media and broadcast outlets responded in turn. Newspapers devoted extensive feature articles analyzing the context, history, and personalities involved, while television networks aired panel discussions with experts and commentators. International outlets, especially in countries with ties to the Commonwealth, explored not only the immediate dispute, but also its broader implications for global perceptions of the royal family. Coverage often included visual timelines, footage from previous Invictus Games, and interviews with participants, creating a narrative that was both comprehensive and highly compelling. The pressure on the palace and Harry's inner circle intensified as the media storm grew. Every action, from travel plans to public appearances, was now filtered through the lens of potential controversy. Advisors scrambled to manage both the factual narrative and the perception of intent. It was no longer sufficient to focus solely on logistics or security. The emotional, psychological, and reputational stakes had skyrocketed. Every decision required foresight, strategy, and a keen understanding of how the global audience might interpret even minor details. Amid this frenzy, the human aspect of the story remained undeniable. Journalists reported on the visible strain on Harry, noting signs of tension and frustration in public appearances and private interactions. Friends and confidants shared accounts of late-night discussions, heated phone calls, and moments of introspection. The public saw glimpses of a man grappling with both personal responsibility and the relentless gaze of the world. Emotional resonance fueled engagement, drawing audiences deeper into the unfolding drama. Behind the polished headlines and viral social media posts, a very different story was unfolding, one that the public would never fully see. Inside the boardrooms and private offices of the Invictus Games Organizing Committee, tensions simmered as leaders attempted to navigate the fallout from Prince Harry's recent demands. The CEO, a seasoned professional accustomed to high-pressure situations, now found himself at the center of a storm that was as much about perception as it was about policy. Every decision carried weight, and every conversation risked leaking to the press. Harry's security request had not been trivial. He had insisted on an unprecedented level of personal protection, citing specific threats and expressing concerns about past incidents where public figures faced unexpected dangers. While the request was grounded in reality, the CEO and his team were faced with logistical and legal constraints that made full compliance challenging. They knew that bending rules for one participant could set a precedent, creating expectations that could ripple through future events. Furthermore, accommodating such measures required a recalibration of staffing, technology, and emergency protocols, each element scrutinized not only internally, but by external authorities responsible for public safety. The narrative quickly divided. One faction of media outlets portrayed Harry as being overly demanding, a royal accustomed to special treatment, perhaps unable to accept the reality that public events come with inherent limitations and shared responsibilities. Pundits and commentators questioned his judgment, debating whether the prince was overstepping boundaries that could unsettle an organization committed to inclusivity and fairness. Headlines blared phrases like royal overreach and Harry versus the games, framing the story as a clash of personal entitlement against institutional order. These narratives, often accompanied by pointed analysis and historical comparisons, fueled public debate and encouraged viewers to weigh in passionately online. Conversely, other media sources sympathized with Harry, framing him as a man acutely aware of the unique risks he faced due to his royal history, his public profile, and past security breaches. Articles delved into his life under constant surveillance, the relentless scrutiny of paparazzi, and the threats that had once necessitated specialized protection. Commentators highlighted that while his security requests might have seemed demanding, they were grounded in legitimate concerns over personal safety. In these narratives, the CEO's refusal became a focal point of criticism, painting the organization as rigid and unaccommodating to someone whose presence was not only symbolic but also inspirational for veterans and participants of the games. The tension between these competing narratives created a chaotic media landscape, leaving audiences unsure of where to place their judgment. Opinion columns, podcasts, and televised debates amplified the controversy, dissecting each reported interaction, analyzing body language from photographs of past events, and even speculating about potential outcomes. Social media, particularly platforms known for viral content, became a battleground of opinion. Hashtags emerged overnight, rallying both for and against Harry, creating echo chambers where misinformation and exaggeration frequently mingled with verified reports. The virality of every tweet, clip, and meme ensured that no narrative remained contained, making each day a new chapter in the public spectacle. Amid this media storm, Harry's personal communications team faced unprecedented challenges. Every statement had to be carefully crafted to convey both clarity and empathy without inflaming the situation further. Briefings, press releases, and public appearances were scrutinized for tone, intent, and implication. The team balanced a delicate tightrope, reassuring the public of Harry's dedication to the games and its participants while defending his need for adequate protection. Missteps in messaging could trigger backlash, making precision essential. Sources close to the team later revealed the emotional toll this level of media attention exacted, with staff members working long hours under relentless pressure, aware that a single misworded sentence could ignite another wave of criticism. Simultaneously, the CEO and his team were not immune to the media onslaught. Their steadfast refusal to comply with certain security demands became a point of contention, with detractors questioning whether the organization was prioritizing protocols over the well-being of a high-profile participant. Interviews with board members, leaked internal memos, and anonymous staff accounts began to circulate, each adding nuance, and sometimes confusion, to the story. The CEO, normally a private figure, now found himself navigating a high-stakes public relations challenge that extended far beyond the boardroom. As speculation intensified, experts in security, event management, and royal affairs were called upon to provide context. Analysts dissected the practicality of Harry's requests, comparing them with historical security measures taken for royals at international events. Security consultants noted the unprecedented nature of balancing such a high-profile individual with the operational demands of a global sporting event, highlighting the difficult choices faced by the CEO and his team. Meanwhile, royal commentators offered psychological and historical perspectives, analyzing Harry's behavior through the lens of past experiences, trauma, and his ongoing efforts to maintain autonomy in the face of constant public scrutiny. Public reactions were equally fervent. Online forums, fan pages, and social media communities erupted with debate, with supporters of Harry emphasizing the moral imperative of his security demands, while critics decried what they saw as excessive insistence on privilege. Polls conducted by various news outlets indicated a sharp divide in public opinion, reflecting the broader societal tension between admiration for the prince's commitment to service and skepticism about the limits of his influence in organizational matters. Each comment, tweet, or post had the potential to be picked up by mainstream media, further amplifying the story and reinforcing the sense that every action was under microscopic examination. Adding another layer of complexity, former participants and veterans associated with the Invictus Games began speaking out. Some offered support for Harry's concerns, citing experiences of overcrowding, security breaches, and instances where high-profile figures had been exposed to risk. Others expressed concern about the potential disruptions that extreme security measures could cause to the game's mission and inclusivity. These voices, coming from within the community, added authenticity and human connection to the narrative, illustrating that the issue was not merely theoretical but deeply relevant to those directly involved in the games. By the middle of this media frenzy, the story had evolved into a global discussion about accountability, safety, privilege, and organizational decision-making. It transcended the original security dispute, touching on broader themes of risk management, the responsibilities of public figures, and the challenges of maintaining public trust in high-profile events. Every article, broadcast segment, and social media post contributed to a complex mosaic of perspectives, forcing the CEO, Harry, and their respective teams to navigate not only logistical and emotional challenges, but also the relentless judgment of a worldwide audience. Behind the polished facade of the Invictus Games headquarters, tension had reached a breaking point. The CEO, long regarded as a measured and deliberate leader, now faced perhaps the most challenging negotiation of his career. Prince Harry's security requests were unprecedented, far exceeding what had been allocated in previous games, and the board members were divided on how to respond. Some saw compliance as a necessary step to ensure Harry's participation and the symbolic weight he carried for veterans worldwide, while others feared setting a precedent that could destabilize the organization's operational protocols. The atmosphere in the boardroom was thick with anticipation and unspoken frustration, every glance and pause carrying the weight of unvoiced opinion. Harry, flanked by his security advisors and personal aides, arrived promptly for a scheduled meeting that had been organized after weeks of email exchanges, phone calls, and informal discussions. He entered the boardroom with a controlled intensity, exuding a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with the palpable tension in the room. The CEO, seated at the head of the table, greeted him formally, but his eyes betrayed a mixture of caution and apprehension. Both parties understood that this meeting was more than just a negotiation over security protocols. It was a test of influence, resolve, and reputation. Failure to reach a resolution could have far-reaching consequences for the games, the prince, and the perception of both entities on the global stage. As the discussion began, Harry laid out his concerns in meticulous detail, referencing past incidents, potential threat scenarios, and the specific logistical requirements needed to guarantee his safety. His voice was calm but firm, each point punctuated by a sense of urgency that could not be ignored. Security advisors supplemented his statements with technical explanations, highlighting vulnerabilities in the event layout, anticipated crowd behavior, and previous breaches at international events. Every diagram, every chart, every carefully prepared slide underscored the seriousness of the situation, illustrating that Harry's demands were not merely personal whims, but rooted in professional risk assessment. The CEO listened, nodding occasionally, but when it came time to respond, he was unwavering. He emphasized the game's responsibility to balance the needs of all participants, veterans, and stakeholders. Accommodating extreme security requests, he argued, could undermine the accessibility and inclusivity of the event, compromise the experience for other attendees, and create logistical complications that might extend far beyond the prince's presence. His tone was measured, yet firm, signaling that while he respected Harry's concerns, he would not compromise the organizational structure or integrity of the games. Board members interjected at various points, some advocating for concessions, citing Harry's global visibility and the potential positive impact on fundraising, media coverage, and veteran engagement. Others countered, warning that capitulating to the prince could embolden future demands from other high-profile participants, potentially destabilizing established protocols. The dialogue grew increasingly heated, with measured arguments giving way to raised voices, pointed exchanges, and moments of near confrontation. The tension in the room became almost tangible, each participant acutely aware that the outcome would shape not just the games, but public perception of leadership, authority, and accountability. Harry remained composed but visibly frustrated. While his public persona often conveyed poise under scrutiny, in this enclosed setting, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily upon him. He referenced past commitments he had made to veterans, emphasizing that their safety and the integrity of his involvement was non-negotiable. "This isn't about me," he stated firmly, eyes sweeping the room. "This is about those who look to the games for inspiration, for hope, and for the reassurance that their experiences and sacrifices are honored safely and respectfully." His words, resonating with a mix of authority and genuine concern, momentarily quieted the room, forcing each board member to reflect on the broader implications beyond procedural regulations and budgetary constraints. The CEO countered with examples from previous events, detailing how adjustments had been made in the past to accommodate VIPs while preserving operational integrity. He highlighted that extreme modifications, especially those that involved restricting access or reallocating resources on a large scale, could result in unintended consequences, including diminished participation from other stakeholders and increased public scrutiny. Each rebuttal was calculated, aiming to balance respect for Harry with a clear assertion that organizational governance could not be overridden by individual demand, no matter how high profile. As the discussion wore on, emotions ebbed and flowed, and the meeting began to feel less like a negotiation and more like a battlefield of strategy and principle. At one point, Harry's security chief presented a scenario analysis, illustrating the potential risks if the proposed security measures were not implemented. The room fell silent, the weight of visualized consequences pressing down on every attendee. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing that while operational rules were important, the implications of ignoring credible security concerns were grave. It became clear that the stakes were no longer theoretical. They were immediate and tangible. As news of the boardroom confrontation leaked to the media, the situation quickly escalated from an internal negotiation to a full-blown public spectacle. Headlines splashed across newspapers, websites, and social media platforms with phrases like "Prince Harry at odds with Invictus Games CEO" and "Security clash threatens prestigious event." Within hours, the story had gone viral, dominating conversations across multiple continents and sparking heated debates online. The tension that had once been confined to a private boardroom now played out in the public eye, magnified by 24-hour news cycles and the relentless scrutiny of digital audiences. Veterans and participants of the Invictus Games expressed mixed reactions. Some defended Harry, praising his insistence on comprehensive security measures as a reflection of genuine concern for safety and the welfare of those attending the games. They highlighted his personal history, his experiences in combat zones, and his intimate understanding of security risks, arguing that his demands were not excessive but grounded in a lifetime of exposure to dangerous environments. Comments flooded forums, social media threads, and veteran networks, many echoing the sentiment that Harry's insistence on thorough protection was not just reasonable but necessary. On the other side, critics questioned the prince's approach, framing it as an overreach or even an act of ego. Opinion pieces in leading publications argued that while security was undoubtedly important, Harry's demands were disproportionate and risked overshadowing the mission and spirit of the games. They raised concerns about resource allocation, suggesting that prioritizing one individual's safety to such an extent could detract from the experience of other participants, volunteers, and attendees. Social media users debated fiercely, with hashtags trending that questioned Harry's priorities, his leadership style, and even the broader implications for royal engagement in international events. Amid the public scrutiny, the CEO of the Invictus Games faced an equally challenging situation. Every statement, every interview, every press release had to be carefully crafted to maintain credibility and assert authority while avoiding escalation. The organization issued a formal statement emphasizing its commitment to the safety of all participants and the importance of balancing operational logistics with security requirements. It acknowledged the ongoing discussions with Harry, framing them as collaborative efforts to ensure the game's success while respecting both his concerns and the organization's protocols. The statement, however measured, could not fully quell speculation or public debate, and journalists continued to probe for details, eager to uncover friction behind the scenes. The story quickly became a topic of discussion in royal circles as well. Close observers noted that the confrontation was a rare public display of discord involving a senior royal, which added layers of intrigue and tension. Analysts speculated on the potential impact on Harry's public image, the perception of the monarchy's involvement in global initiatives, and the symbolism inherent in his relationship with the Invictus Games. Each detail of the boardroom clash was dissected, analyzed, and broadcast repeatedly, feeding a narrative of conflict, negotiation, and high-stakes decision-making that captivated audiences worldwide. Meanwhile, the digital sphere amplified the story's intensity. Memes, opinion videos, and analysis clips began circulating across social media platforms, many dramatizing the confrontation and speculating on its potential consequences. Influencers and commentators engaged in spirited debates, dissecting Harry's approach, the CEO's resistance, and the broader implications for international events involving high-profile figures. The virality of the story not only increased pressure on both parties, but also shaped public perception, forcing them to consider not just the practical logistics of security, but the narrative being constructed in real time. Public figures, politicians, and celebrities began weighing in, some expressing support for Harry's insistence on rigorous safety measures, others echoing the concerns raised by critics. Interviews on television programs and radio segments further fueled the controversy, offering expert opinions on risk management, event security, and the responsibilities of high-profile individuals in public roles. The combination of real-time media coverage and social commentary created a sense of urgency, as the pressure to reach a resolution before the games intensified with each passing day. Amidst the media frenzy, Harry maintained a careful balance in his public responses. He refrained from directly criticizing the CEO or the organization, instead emphasizing the importance of safety, the well-being of veterans, and the game's mission to inspire and uplift participants. His measured approach, while aiming to project professionalism and responsibility, did not entirely quell speculation, and every public appearance, interview, or social media post was scrutinized for clues about his intentions, mindset, and potential next moves. The chapter also highlighted the emotional toll on Harry himself. Privately, he expressed frustration over the perception that his security concerns were being interpreted as excessive or self-serving. Close confidants noted that while he remained committed to the games, the intense scrutiny and public debate weighed heavily, creating a constant tension between personal principles, public expectations, and organizational compromise. Emotional vulnerability and resilience became central themes as Harry navigated the intricate landscape of media narratives, personal responsibility, and global attention. As the public chatter intensified, the real drama continued away from the cameras, hidden from the scrutinizing eyes of the media. Behind the walls of the Invictus Games headquarters, tension crackled like static electricity. The CEO, known for his calm and measured demeanor, found himself navigating a situation far more volatile than anticipated. He was dealing not just with a high-profile royal insisting on stringent security measures, but with the reality that the world was watching every move, ready to interpret every gesture and statement through the lens of controversy.